name is Emilio, and I lived on the streets for a while many years ago in the 90s when I was 21. After graduating from high school, I found a job as a security officer in a well-known nightclub in the city. During that period, I fell in with bad company and started using prohibited substances. This caused me to lose my job, and eventually I was left on the street with no place to go, since my parents had passed away when I was little and I was basically alone in the world. Whenever I think back to that time in my life, I get a knot in my stomach, because there were so many painful things I saw and experienced being homeless. One of the hardest parts, apart from trying to get food, was finding a place to shelter when the rainy season came, as well as adequate clothing. It was precisely one of those rainy nights when I lived the most frightening experience I remember, not only of that stage but of my whole life. At that time I had very little time to be on the street, and I started to meet people who were in the same situation as me. Several of them gave me advice on how to earn some money and get some food and also, to pay for my addiction. So that's how I started taking small jobs at the local market, from sweeping the premises to helping to load and unload the trucks that came in with fruits and vegetables. Just doing that job, I met Furman and Freckles, another couple of homeless guys around my age. They asked me where I was staying, since by then the rains had started, and I told them I was taking shelter in a church where I could spend the night and protect myself from the cold and rain, and with the little I earned at the market, I could buy some food a day. However, by those times it gets a bit complicated, as the activity in the market drops because of the rains and there are not many odd jobs to do anymore. So these guys told me that they were staying in an abandoned warehouse that was about 4 blocks away. I remember that Fermin told me that there was a big group of people there, that they had mattresses, blankets, and had made bonfires, and he invited me to stay with them in that place. Besides, he assured me that it was less dangerous, because homeless people who were alone, bad things used to happen to them in that city, and it is always safer to be with a group of people. I thanked him, but told him that at the time I felt I was fine where I was. But the main reason I refused to go with them that time is because I knew that these people were consuming a much stronger and dangerous substance than what I used to consume. Not to go into details, this was something that claimed many lives a year, and honestly, I was already in a deep enough pit to dive deeper to the bottom, and I knew that if I started hanging out with these people, that was a possibility. Plus, I had heard that some people lived there who were quite dangerous, so I didn't want to put myself at any more risk than I already was. However, there came a time when I had no choice but to seek shelter with them. That year, the rainy season was quite intense, and at that time it had rained for 4 days almost consecutively, so there was no work, and the place where I was staying started to get wet. I looked for shelter all over the square, but I could not find a dry place. Then I ran into Fermin, who was carrying some bags with some blankets that a neighbor in the area had given him, as he told me. When he saw me all soaked and shivering, looking for a place to get warm, he approached me and offered me once again to stay in the shelter where he was. He told me that they had gotten food and that there was room for one more. He showed me the blankets and said he would give me one for the night. By this time I was completely hungry and too cold, so this time I did not hesitate to accept his offer and went with him to the abandoned warehouse. After walking in the rain for about 5 blocks, we finally arrived at the place, which was a rather large warehouse. It was completely sealed, and the entrance was covered with lumber. There was garbage everywhere, and the smell, well, it was not something I was not already quite used to. As we entered that place, I realized that I had not been fooled. There were actually quite a few bonfires and candles, it was warm at least, and there were a large number of people spread out in several groups. However, while we were walking, I heard from the background that someone began to reproach Fermin for taking me. This person seemed to be very annoyed by the fact that Fermin had brought someone else to the place. He was telling him that there were already too many, and that they were managing not to starve to death for him to bring one more mouth. I immediately stood still. I could not move forward. Then Fermin put his arm around me and said, "Don't worry, he is nobody to decide who comes and who does not." At that moment, he replied to the guy that he was the one who got that warehouse in the first place, and that he was not going to accommodate me in his place but in his. Then they had a little exchange of words, and finally the guy did not say anything else. We continued walking, but as I got closer, I began to perceive a strong smell of grilled meat. With the hunger I had, this immediately made my gut sound. Instinctively, I began to look for where the smell was coming from, and I realized that it was coming from the back of the warehouse, where the largest group of people was. These were sitting around a bonfire to which they were not only throwing garbage to keep the fire going, but they were also making food there. Hearing the sound of my guts, Fermin let out a laugh and said to me, "Relax, my friend. I'll get you some meat to eat." To be honest, I was a little surprised that they were grilling meat, because meat is expensive and there was a large group of people there, so it would take a good amount to feed them all. Besides, there were no butcher shops nearby to have given them leftovers or anything like that, but I was too hungry and I really didn't care about that. Fermin walked towards the campfire site while I stayed where I was. I really didn't want to cause another altercation, this time over food. My friend approached me and brought me some pieces of meat in the lid of a milk can. I immediately began to eat and thank him for what he was doing for me, since he was not only saving me from the cold but also from hunger. He just told me, "Relax, friend. That's what we are here for, to help each other." Something I thought was very noble of him. Honestly, the meat was good, but it had a strange taste. I had never eaten any meat that tasted like that. It was clearly not beef. But as I told them, I was absolutely starving and I was not going to ask where they got it from. I was grateful that they shared some with me. After eating my plate, I kept moving forward behind Fermin, who was guiding me towards the place where I was going to stay. This was in the right corner of the back of the warehouse, and to get there, it was necessary to pass near where the bonfire where they were roasting meat was. So as I passed by, I took a look towards that place, and when I did, I was completely frozen. Very close to the bonfire where everyone was cooking and eating, there was a human body lying on the ground. This one had its torso open and had no part of the limbs. And as I looked further towards the bottom, I saw that there was someone holding what looked like a leg with awl and foot, and was dissecting the meat with a large knife. The moment I saw this, my body froze. I felt my legs go limp and a huge knot formed in my stomach. I immediately started to vomit. I couldn't help it. While everyone started to shout at me and complain that I was making a mess of the place, I looked at Fermin with a horrified face, and he told me very calmly, "Hey buddy, take it easy. Nobody did anything to him. He was already dead, and we can't afford to waste anything here. He is a survival brother, and you should know that." I can't explain the feeling I felt at that moment. There are no words to say it. On the one hand, I was terrified of what I was seeing, but I was even more terrified of the fact that there were a lot of people around, even children, who were eating from that man's body as if it was something normal. At that moment, I felt more than ever the pain of being in that situation. I was more aware than ever of how atrocious hunger can be. But above all, it was a great awakening. Because from that night on, my life changed completely. After vomiting everything I had ingested a moment ago and trying to control the retching I still had, I put my hand on my friend's shoulder. I thanked him for the help, but I told him that I had to leave, that I could not be there. He looked at me and seemed to understand, so he did not say anything, just nodded his head, and I ran away from that place. That night I took shelter under the front roof of a tent, which was wide enough to keep out the rain. Fortunately, I still had the blanket that Fermin gave me, so I was able to spend the night. The next day, by God's grace, the rain stopped, and when I woke up, I saw a group of missionaries from an evangelical church offering food and preaching to several people on the street. One of them approached me with a lunch of food and began to talk to me about the Word of God. This person also told me about a free rehabilitation center where they could help me with my addiction problem so that I could transform my life. At that moment, everything I had experienced the night before was reflected in my head, and that gave me the push I needed to accept help and finally get out of the dark world I was in. That same day, I was taken to the rehabilitation center, and with God's grace, I was able to overcome my addiction and recover my life. Since then, I became part of the church, and to this day, I dedicate myself to help the homeless and give them the same opportunity they gave me. Unfortunately, my friend Fermin never wanted to leave the street life, and shortly after, he left this world victim of an overdose. And as for the man of that day, It was never known who he was. The news never appeared in the press, so it is possible that he was also homeless. My name is Andrew and I am 49 years old. I can say that I've lived a long enough life to have heard and seen all sorts of strange, disturbing, and wacky things. And how could I not? I have spent most of my life living in Miami, so needless to say, on many occasions I have seen firsthand why it is that the infamous Florida man is always making headlines across the country. As a former military veteran and former homeless person, I could say that I may have been one of those infamous Florida men in the past, but I can say, without a doubt, that no matter how tough you think you are, how many battles you have fought, or how many crazy things you have seen, life will always find a way to surprise you and show you that it will always have the power to shock you to your core. That is something I learned very, very well after living what I am going to tell you next. As I told you, I spent many years in the Army and participated in several important operations. Among them, the Operation Red Dawn in Iraq. Then, for various reasons, I spent a few years on the streets drifting between a rock and a hard place. But no matter how many shocking and painful things I have to see or live, I always manage to deal with it. And in general, I always recover well, or almost always, because of all the things I have had to face. There was only one that really shook me to the core, and with which I confess that I still have nightmares because I never thought that something like that could ever happen, let alone in broad daylight in the middle of the city. This was a beautiful sunny day in Miami, like many others. I was driving through the city in the middle of a concrete mess due to a road under construction. For the past few months I hadn't touched my car, just rode my bike everywhere, and that day was no exception. I was riding my bike down the shoulder, but I wasn't riding it. I hadn't slept well the night before, and honestly I was too sleepy to pedal in a straight line, so I was basically walking beside my bike on the shoulder of the road. There was a sidewalk next to me, but it was on the other side of a concrete barrier, one like the ones they use to divide traffic directions on freeways. I could have jumped it on foot, but not with my bike. The thing is, I don't know exactly how I ended up sandwiched there, between the cars and the concrete. But after what happened a few moments later, I wouldn't take that road again as an alternative ever in my life. The sun was at its highest point and it was shining so brightly that it was starting to hurt my eyesight. I squinted to look ahead and saw that there was a bridge across the road. Excellent, I thought. A nice wide overpass to finally get some shade. I started to speed up my steps at a pace that felt rather silly considering that there were a lot of cars passing by me. But at that moment, among the deafening noise of each passing car, there was another sound that I couldn't quite identify. What I was hearing in the background was something that sounded like a shouting argument that I couldn't understand very well. Something like a fight between drunk people, and the only phrases I could make out were, "You're going to regret it, and I'm going to finish you." That's probably not something you would expect to hear in broad daylight and in the middle of traffic in your city, but in Miami it's more than common. But still, I couldn't help but think that this sounded a little strange. At the time, I thought the lack of sleep was messing with my mind, so I kept going. But as I got closer to the bridge, the screaming got louder. It definitely sounded like a scream, but there was something else there. It was like a dog growling or something. It was a really weird sound, but every time I thought I was about to decipher it, a car flew past me, and then the sound distorted. When I finally reached the bridge, my curiosity piqued. I could definitely tell that the place where the noise was coming from was right in front of me, just a few more meters under the shadow. I looked over the edge of the barrier to the sidewalk and saw two pairs of men's hairy legs sliding over each other in the middle of the sidewalk. I instinctively averted my gaze because I definitely didn't want to see what was happening above thigh level. I remember at that moment, while these guys were doing their thing, or so I thought I was thinking, what's going through these guys' heads doing stuff like that on the side of the road, and in the hot sun? Well, it was obvious that nobody cared, because nobody stopped their way to do or say anything to them. Why would I? I kept walking in the bright sunshine, trying not to make a big deal out of it, I thought. Just another day in Florida. I did my best to keep my eyes fixed while I rested for a moment under the shade. I was really grateful for the little break from the intense sunlight. But then, those strange sounds started to be heard again. They were like growls of some animal, and that forced me to look again. It was there when my eyes saw the most creepy and surreal thing I ever in my life thought to look at. There were two naked guys on the edge of the sidewalk, one lying on the concrete, and the other crouched on top of him, tearing at his face with his teeth. I was in complete shock, and that's something that doesn't happen to me very often. There was hematic fluid gushing out of the man and spreading all over the concrete, bones appearing through the bites on the guy's face on the floor, and the attacker had the victim's flesh in his teeth, chewing on it and making noises like an animal growling. But the most terrifying thing was when this man raised his head and stared at me. It was like a real zombie attacking his victim. At that precise moment, I jumped on my bike in a split second and pedaled at full speed. All the drowsiness I had a moment before was completely erased by the adrenaline rush I felt at that moment. As I pedaled, I kept looking back to see if that psychopath was following me, but fortunately he wasn't. Apparently he was too busy feasting on that unfortunate man. So I kept pedaling as fast as I could, rolled down the first ramp I found on the road, and immediately went to look for a policeman. Luckily I found one fairly close by, but he was being surrounded by several citizens who seemed to be demanding something, and the cop looked annoyed. However, I was in a complete panic, and I never panic, so I must have been a sight to see. I pushed my way through all those people, stood right in the cop's face and yelled, "There's a zombie eating a man on the damn pedestrian path up the ramp." At that instant, everything went silent. "What do you mean, zombie?" the cop asked me. "There's a guy eating another man's face," I said, as he stared at me. Then, finally, it seemed as if something clicked in his brain, and without another word, he walked straight into his car and said something over the radio. He then drove up the exit ramp in the opposite direction, out of our sight. Meanwhile, the other civilians exchanged some strange looks, all in an understandable lack of words. Some of them looked like bicyclists, others just looked like people who had gotten out of their cars, and I wondered how long that thing had been doing that monstrosity with all those people passing by. An instant later, the shots rang out, 5 of them, one after the other. Everyone on the street stopped what they were doing, and in just a few minutes we saw a line of police cars followed by an ambulance, and almost at the same time, an army of journalists arrived to broadcast the scoop live on the scene. That afternoon, the headlines were everywhere, and that's when I learned that the victim had been a homeless man. The headline said things like, "Cannibal eats Florida homeless man," "Zombie attack in Florida," and the like. This was the talk of the town for weeks, and some seemed fascinated with the subject, but not me. I would never want to see pictures or videos of that horrible tragedy, as it was enough for me to be there for a few moments to be shocked for months. The hair on the back of my neck still stands up every time I go under a bridge, and every now and then I have nightmares about that moment. Fortunately, the man survived, albeit in very bad shape. My name is Angel, and I am one of the many Mexican immigrants who left their native country and crossed the border in search of the American dream. However, in my case, the dream turned into a nightmare, and I ended up living on the streets for several years. It is not necessary to go too deep into the subject to know that my life has not been easy, and it never was. But this stage was perhaps the lowest point of my entire existence. Basically, my day-to-day life was about doing whatever it took to get food and wandering the alleys every night, looking for a place to shelter from the cold and the dangers of the night. This with only a piece of cardboard as a bed and a pile of old and dirty cloth as a blanket. No family, no friends, no job, and practically nothing to live for. And I say this because during the time I was living on the streets, there was something that tormented me. It was a thought that was constantly in my head, a feeling that would not leave me alone, and I did not understand why, until the truth was revealed to me in the most frightening way you can imagine. One night, when I was a few weeks old living on the streets, I felt as if an icy air enveloped me. I was asleep at the time, but I woke up with that feeling and an intense shiver running down my back. I sat up on the dirty cardboard where I slept, put my hands inside the old wool coat I was wearing, which I had found in the garbage a few days before, and looked around with a strange feeling of being watched by something or someone. At that moment, my senses became alert. I looked in all directions but saw nothing. There was nothing out of the ordinary, but that feeling did not go away. After a while, I simply forced myself to sleep again. But that was only the first of many nights in which the same thing would happen to me, because that feeling persisted for many days, even months. As the days went by, the nights became more disturbing, to the point that there was no longer a single night that I did not wake up knowing or believing that I was being seen. But then, to this sensation was added the sound of someone talking in my ear, as if whispering words to me that I could not remember. For months I tried to ignore all these disturbing sensations that overwhelmed me every night and prevented me from falling asleep. I convinced myself that it was all a product of my exhausted mind, overwhelmed by lack of food and sleep. However, one early morning, while wandering the streets of the city in search of a place to sleep or sleep badly like every night, I began to feel the same sensation that tormented me every day. But this time, that entity that had been stalking me and interrupting my sleep for months finally manifested itself before my eyes. I know what really happened because I was not sleeping, I was not delirious, and I have never consumed prohibited substances, so I know it was completely real. That night, a dark and translucent figure manifested before me, in which I could distinguish a face, but with empty eyes, and the rest was like a kind of tunic made only of shadow. It was like very black and thick smoke that did not touch the ground. It just floated. When this entity manifested itself before me, I was completely paralyzed. But then it spoke to me, and I realized that it was the same spectral voice that I heard whispering in my ear every night. It was then when that voice that seemed to come from the very tomb resounded in my mind saying, "Angel, it is your time." At that moment I felt every hair on my body stand on end, and terror paralyzed me completely. I tried to run away, but every alley I headed down seemed to lead me back to that specter, and with every step I took I could feel her behind me. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, as that thing, which I was convinced was the manifestation of death, approached me without my being able to do anything to stop it. For an instant, a dark thought crossed my mind. I thought, "Angel, why are you trying to escape? You don't have anything worth living for. Just give yourself up. No one will miss you anyway." However, the survival instinct, the one we all have so ingrained in our primitive consciousness, refused to give up the fight. So I just kept running, even though I knew it was in vain, and so it was in a desperate attempt to escape my fate, practically marked, that I found myself in front of a large church. I found myself in front of a big church, a huge cathedral that is in that part of the city, but it was closed, so the only thing that crossed my mind was to sit down and pray. Pray with all the desperation I felt, and ask God to deliver me from that spirit of death that was chasing me. At that moment I saw how the spirit surrounded me and began to approach me slowly. Then, already a little resigned, I closed my eyes tightly and began to pray what I thought was going to be my last Ave Maria. But at that moment, suddenly, I began to feel a very different sensation to the panic that had enveloped me that night. It was like a kind of sense of relief, of infinite peace, something that I can only define in that way. There was no fear, no worry about what was going to happen, just a feeling of tranquility, as if everything was fine and calm, something I had never experienced in my life. After a moment, I opened my eyes, and I could see that figure had his bony index finger on my forehead, but immediately after I opened my eyes, he began to fade away. But strangely, I did not feel fear again, or anything, only tranquility and a sense of clarity and calmness that I had not felt for many years. The figure had already vanished, and the dawn tinged the sky with golden and reddish tones, completely dispelling the darkness of the night. I don't know if that was a sign that I should do something with my life, or I don't know what, because what I lived was real, it was not a dream. Since that night, something changed in me. That same morning, I went into the church, and I told the priest what I had experienced. He looked at me carefully and told me that when God gives us a second chance, we should not waste it. When I left, I went to a nearby store and asked the owner for a job, almost certain that she would refuse, as they all did when they saw what I looked like. But this was not the case. She gave me a job that day as a cleaner. And not only that, she gave me clean clothes and shoes, and that was the beginning of a transformation that even I would not have believed possible. In the following months, I got a place to live, and today, after 10 years, I am head of the maintenance staff in that same warehouse, and I have never gone back to the streets. Emir was a street dweller who was very close to my university, and to whom I always gave my change when I had more. This was something I did only with him, as I usually keep a strict rule of not giving money to these individuals. Instead, I donate it to local known and recognized charities, where I can be sure that the money will go to a specific cause. But Emir was special. This man didn't just ask for money, and that was it. He sang opera, and he did it really very well. All things considered, it was clear that Emir was asking for money because of the poverty in which he lived and the lack of housing. But I always thought it was admirable that he was trying to perform a service in exchange for the money he received from people, and not just begging. That's why I always collaborated with him. Besides, I don't like to carry coins, so I always gave them to him. It wasn't much either, just $1 or something more each time. I saw Emir every day, so from time to time I would engage him in conversation, even if I had no money to give him at that moment, since he liked to make the students laugh with his jokes. And the truth was entertaining to talk with Emir. He was someone with medium level of culture, but quite older than me. He must have been between 40 and 50 years old, so we did not have too many topics of conversation in common, so we mostly chatted quickly about the news or the weather or whatever, nothing too deep. However, sometimes he would randomly share something so intimate, I felt compelled to reciprocate with something, at least superficially personal. For example, on one occasion he mentioned that he almost went to college on a baseball scholarship, but drugs ruined everything. I just replied, "Oh boy, I'm sorry to hear that you didn't get to take advantage of that scholarship," or something like that. He was nice to me, and I reciprocated the gesture, as I was never a prejudiced person and had no problem with having a small friendship with someone in his condition. I just never imagined that this would lead me to live through the hell I had to go through shortly after. Once, Emir called out to me as I was walking down the street with a teacher, and I didn't want to be rude, so I walked over to where he was just to say a quick hello and introduce my teacher. When we left, my teacher was horrified and asked me why Emir knew my name, so I explained to him about our little friendship, but he said something that I didn't understand very well. He explained that the homeless people in this city were not like the homeless people in my little hometown. At the time, I thought he was being somewhat elitist, and I think he realized that I had not taken him seriously, because after we left the subject, just before I left, he reiterated to me that I should not forge friendships with the homeless population of the city, or even give them money, because most of the street people like Emir were usually people who had serious addiction problems and mostly had criminal records or mental disorders. I must say I was very surprised, because this professor used to be quite progressive and compassionate, so I appealed to him by presenting Emir as a victim of a post-capitalist society and all the other things I had learned in his own classes, but he basically meant none of that. I went on to say that Emir became chronically homeless because of the system, so now we should act accordingly, and we should not stigmatize a person for a circumstance that any of us could be victims of. Then, my professor simply implored me not to continue talking to Emir at all. I shook my head thinking, "Okay, boomer." I felt this warning as if it was confirmation that he was being classist, and I was doing the right thing, leading a new way, breaking down barriers and improving society. The next day, I went over to where he was and wanted to share some time with Emir, but this time he was very irritable and distant, and I wasn't sure why until he said, "What about your boyfriend? Do you two live together or what?" I had no idea what he was talking about. I said, "What boyfriend?" And he replied, "The guy I met yesterday, you were walking down the street with him." I laughed at that, explaining to him that he wasn't my boyfriend, he was just my professor and academic advisor, and suddenly he wasn't irritable anymore. He was more talkative than ever. I probably should have taken this as a red flag, but I didn't think much about it. Then I only saw Amir once or twice a week, and only for a few minutes. From that meeting on, he started bringing me gifts. Every time I passed by, he had a flower for me or a piece of metal machine or anything else. I never refused because I thought it was a way of preserving his dignity by accepting my money, like when he sang opera. One of my roommates once commented on the flower, and when I explained it to her, she said it was strange. I thought she was being elitist too, and that I was an enlightened class divide saving enlightenment, and that I was far superior to her neoliberal paranoia. I mean, come on, it was just a flower, no big deal. My advisor observed all this and mentioned it to me again a while later, saying that he was worried that I was being manipulated. At that point, I tried to tell him about Amir's opera singing and his impressions, and how he almost went to college. But then, I remembered the reason he lost his baseball scholarship and stopped dead in my tracks. Looking at things through that lens made me reconsider everything. I thought about what my professor had told me, skipping the details. We talked for half an hour, and I finally connected the dots and realized that Amir had a long history of substance abuse. And sometimes he would mention how a girlfriend he had overreacted to something he had done, and that what happened with her had derailed his life, in addition to the substances. At that point, I decided that maybe I should seriously think about distancing myself from Amir for a bit, but it didn't take, because very shortly thereafter the pandemic hit and classes went virtual, so to save on rent, I went to my parents' house. It was still in that same state, but not near campus at all, so I didn't see Amir again. About 3 weeks after I was home, I was looking at a friend's Instagram story. When I heard Amir's opera singing in the background, I thought, I forgot about him, I hope he's doing well, and kept looking at different stories. Later that night, something about the story stuck in my stomach and popped up in my mind several times unconsciously. And I ignored it, but it kept coming back, so I decided to go watch the story again. And that's when I realized that my friend's video was not from our college town. It was from my hometown, where I was currently, which was much smaller and not near my college at all. This scared me a little, especially since in one of our conversations I mentioned to him where I was from, and that my family still lived there. However, I reassured myself that after all, they all moved away when the pandemic hit. And while my town wasn't close to the university, it wasn't like it was on the other side of the country either, so it could have just been a coincidence. I really wanted to mention it to my parents, but they had always warned me not to talk to homeless people, other than, "Can I buy you lunch?" So I felt too embarrassed to explain the situation to them. And besides, maybe it was just a coincidence. I thought it was very conceited of me to claim that he followed me here because, come on, I'm not cool enough for someone to be obsessed with me. We have a type 1 diabetic in the family, so we take quarantine very seriously. I thought I wouldn't see him again anyway. I'm not going out anytime soon, no matter where I am, so it's okay. But I was so wrong. One day, a girl from my high school who also ended up at my college called me on the phone, and in short said, "I know this is going to sound really weird, but I feel like I should tell you. I was downtown, and a panhandler asked me about you. Specifically, he knew you were in a social science club, and he knew your major." I didn't tell him anything, but I was quite alarmed, first because, how would he know that I knew this girl? But once we talked, I knew she had been wearing a sweatshirt from our college, so I thought about it, and decided that he probably saw that sweatshirt and thought maybe he knew me from college since we were both from this town. I thought maybe he was just trying to find out how I was doing. I thought it was very sweet of him, but it was also weird, but hey, he was a little weird. That was part of his charm. I thanked my friend for calling me to let me know about this, but I told her not to worry. Besides, I wasn't. Anyway, I wasn't in town for much longer. I decided to move back to live near campus. It was impossible to finish my studies with all my family around all day, so I returned to campus sometime later. I didn't think about Amir at all until I saw him back. He was on the same corner, just a week after I returned to campus. At that point, I knew something was wrong, so I stopped giving him money. I stopped talking to him, but I felt really stupid about how loudly I had been insisting that nothing was wrong. that everything was fine and everyone else was paranoid and elitist. So I decided not to tell anyone what I had noticed. It would be too humiliating to have to swallow my words and admit in front of them that they were right. Instead, I started avoiding Amir. I barely left my dorm and never went to campus by the usual route. I used another route so I wouldn't run into him. I felt a little bad about hurting his feelings, but I figured he would get the message, and better safe than sorry. After final exams, I decided to visit my brother in a different state. His roommates had moved out, leaving an extra bed, so I drove to his house to celebrate the end of the year and get away from it all. Around the 9th day, an unusual sound woke me up much earlier than usual. When my brother is not working or at school, he sleeps until about noon. So that day I thought it was very strange to hear my brother talking at the door. So I got up to see what was going on, because since the quarantine started, we hadn't seen anyone. As I left the room, I could tell that my brother's condition was somewhat altered. Although he was talking politely to someone outside through the crack in the door, when he turned around he saw me very angry. He was angry with me about something. I didn't know who he was talking to, because I didn't catch a glimpse of the person on the other side. Then he closed the door briefly and walked over to me, stood right in front of my face and whispered, but almost shouted, "Mom and Dad are going to kill you for this." I had no idea what he was talking about, but my first thought was that the police had come to arrest me for something. It was the only logical thought I could generate first thing in the morning, but the only thing I could imagine they would arrest me for was my fake ID, which I only used to get into concerts and night spots. Obviously none lately. I was really in shock, but my brother was still very angry with me, telling me that I was in serious trouble and other things like, "Why the hell didn't you tell me? What the fuck were you thinking?" But then I realized that didn't line up with getting arrested, so I finally asked him what he was talking about, and to my utter shock he said, "You're dating a 50-year-old guy? Dad will kill you and then he'll have a heart attack and die too. That'll kill Mom. And on top of that, you invited him to my house when we are supposed to be socially distanced. You two can go to a hotel because he's not coming in here. You saved yourself that I wasn't a jerk to him, but if you don't tell him to go away now, that will change drastically, I'm warning you." I listened intently and in complete silence to the whole string of threats from my brother, who was clearly about to have a breakdown from how furious he was. But I had no idea what he was talking about. I wasn't even able to connect the pieces at the time, as Amir was just a very small part of my life. My whole world had been turned upside down by a pandemic in the previous months, so he was very much on the back burner, so it didn't even cross my mind. So I just said the first thing that came to my mind, "Dude, I don't know why you're getting so mad at me. I don't even have a boyfriend. I don't know what you're talking about. Someone's got the wrong house, obviously." My brother seemed ready to grab me by the collar. He said, "We're adults, come on, don't lie to me. I'm not Mom or Dad. I can't help you with this if you're going to lie to my face." I reiterated that I wasn't lying, and I think he could tell by my expression and tone that I was telling the truth. He knows me very well. So now he was just as confused and irritated as I was. Then he said he was here about his girlfriend, and he used your name. He recited a lot of very accurate information. I think he said that you guys had a fight and that he was here to fix things. At that moment I started to feel a strong emptiness in the pit of my stomach, because it was only then that Amir came to my mind. But I wanted to think that this was not the case, because if this happened on campus or at my house, it is disturbing just the same. But at least he already had that information. But in this case I changed states. My brother moved to this state to go to school, and I don't know anyone here except him and his friends. So I finally did the obvious. I went to see who the person at the door was. I must tell you that when I saw him, I almost didn't recognize him at first, because he had showered, shaved, and was dressed in clean clothes. For the first time since I've known him, I saw him as anyone. But I kid you not, it was Amir standing at my brother's door, hundreds of miles from his corner next to campus. Seeing him standing there, I felt so scared I couldn't speak. My heart was pounding like I was slipping under deep water with my legs tied together. I just walked away from the door and sat on the couch and tried to compose myself. My brother thought this was my affirmation that he really was my boyfriend, as if my biggest secret had been exposed, but the truth was much worse. My brother realized that I was crying. Then he sat down, calmed down, and apologized. and tried to console me, but still thinking that my state was because he had discovered my relationship with a 40-year-old. But then I whispered almost breathlessly, "You just don't understand. He followed me here." My brother still didn't understand. He thought I didn't want him to come here, and asked me why we fought, even though he thought this guy was really my boyfriend. I managed to suppress my panic long enough to explain to him in broad strokes what was really going on, but I don't think he fully understood how creepy this was, because at that point he started joking about it, told me it was funny, and that he was going to take care of it, then went to the door and told him that he had just realized I wasn't home, that I must have packed up and left early. He also suggested that he should do the same, as he was taking the quarantine very seriously, but then he turned to me and winked. But after that moment, things stopped seeming funny to him, and he realized that this was more serious than he thought. Emir told him in a rather hostile tone that he was lying, as he had heard me speak a moment ago. He said in a demanding tone, "I heard her there talking to you. Tell her I'm sorry. I don't know why she's been avoiding me, but I cleaned up for her and I'll take her wherever she wants to go. I want you to tell her this, and don't lie to me, because I will know if you do." That really upset my brother, and he replied, "Brother, you're not taking her anywhere. Get off my terrace before we have a serious problem." Then it started to sound like Emir was walking away, but instead he was moving closer to the window. When I saw him looking through the window, he looked very different than I had seen him before, even a few seconds before. For when I looked through the peephole, his clothes were clean and he looked good in terms of grooming, but his eyes looked bugged out of his head, and he had white stuff stuck in the corners of his mouth. I hadn't noticed at first, but he was shaking a little, and you could tell he was totally disconnected from reality. He started banging on the windows, yelling things like, "That's my girlfriend, you can't keep her in there. Let her out. I'm coming for you, baby. I'm coming to rescue you now." I couldn't tell if it was a threat or a comfort. I was just so scared I didn't know what to do. I couldn't run, I couldn't move, I was completely paralyzed. At this point, my brother was so shocked by this man's sudden outburst, he was getting ready to confront him forcefully. But I was trying to make my voice work to beg him not to. I was so anxious, scared, embarrassed, and sad that I had ignored all the warning signs in front of my eyes so many times, that I was now in this situation not knowing what to do. All I could think about was that this man could hurt my brother and myself, and that this was something I could have avoided. Only if I had been more mature and less arrogant with all that progressive crap I had in my head. I had many opportunities to put a stop to this situation, and I just didn't do it. Now I was in the middle of a very dangerous situation, and I had no idea how to fix it. I had so many thoughts swirling around in my head and so much fear that all I could do was scream. But not scream words, no, just scream my head off. Emir was totally out of his mind and screaming insults like crazy at my brother, while my brother was trying to push me away from the door to let him out and face him. I was begging him not to come out. Well, my brother is an athletic guy, but I don't think he has ever been in a physical situation. And when we were in that struggle, there was a sound like glass breaking and falling to the floor. That's when we saw Emir's arm through the window. At that moment, there was an eerie silence for a moment. No one moved. I think I even stopped screaming. But when he withdrew his hand, everything went into chaos. A large amount of blood started gushing out as he pulled his hand through the glass. Then Emir started screaming things with much less sense than before. "Look what you did to me. This is a test. I told you they couldn't stop me. I'm invincible," and all sorts of things without the slightest coherence. The look in his eyes became more distant and completely out of this world. As for my brother, seeing all the blood splattered all over the floor, he started screaming, as he was always very sensitive to it. But this also made him realize that we were in real danger, and he finally yelled at me, "Call 911, would you?" As he leaned against the door, which Emir was kicking very hard. At that moment, as I reached for my phone, I took a peek outside through the hole in the window, and to my complete horror I watched as Emir held a large, sharp piece of glass in his hand. My heart was racing like never before, and if I was already panicking, I was now simply in the middle of a nervous breakdown. I started yelling at my brother not to move away from the door and told him what this deranged man had in his hand. I was so scared at that moment, I don't even remember calling 911, but I sure did, because within 10 minutes a police car arrived, and upon seeing the scene they acted very quickly and arrested Amir. I had never felt that mix of panic and relief in my life. It was too strange, but that's how it really felt. As the cops took him to the patrol car, he kept trying to tell them that his girlfriend was trapped in the house, and that he had come all this way to save her. My poor brother was even momentarily handcuffed, and had to explain that he had not taken me hostage, until I was finally able to articulate and explain to them over the top what had really happened. But probably one of the most disturbing memories of this whole terrifying event is that when Amir was taken away in the back of the patrol car, he started singing opera. This was really creepy, like something out of a horror movie. After that, we filed a formal complaint, and Amir faced charges of assault, trespassing, harassment, and a couple of other charges that I don't remember now. What I do remember is that this man already had 2 previous tickets for aggravated assault and sexual harassment.